In the colonial history of Nigeria, revolts were not uncommon. But in 1929, something extraordinary happened. Not on the battlefield, but in the marketplaces, village squares, and dusty roads of the then southeastern Nigeria. And no, it wasn't men with guns or machetes. It wasn't soldiers with strategies or armored tanks. It was thousands of women, mothers, daughters, farmers, and traders who rose up in defiance of British colonial rule in what would be remembered forever as the Aba Women's Riot or the Women's Riot of 1929. In this edition of Back in History, we take you back in time to this unforgettable part of the history of the people of Nigeria. We welcome you to this edition of Back in History. Aba Women's Riot was an organized uprising, one rooted in injustice, culture, and courage, not chaos. It shook the foundations of British colonial administration and redefined the power of collective resistance. So what sparked this war of rappers and voices? Why did it spread like wildfire across eastern Nigeria? And what legacy did these women leave behind, not just for their daughters, but for the entire nation? These are the questions we will be answering in this video. Before 1929, Nigeria was a country stitched together by force and ruled with a heavy colonial hand. The British weren't just administering the land, they were reshaping it to fit their system of governance, economy, and control. In eastern Nigeria, where the Aba Women's Riot would later explode, traditional power structures were already under attack, and frustration was bubbling beneath the surface. Ikorobasi in present-day Akwa Ibom State was one of the epicenters of the riots. Women also revolted in many other parts of what is today the southeast and south-south of Nigeria, comprising several states and ethnic nationalities. It was indeed a movement, and the movement was unprecedented. For centuries, communities in this region had operated through a decentralized system of government. Leadership wasn't centralized around the king, but spread through councils of elders, titled men and women, age grades, and spiritual authorities. Women were allowed to play significant roles in governance. They weren't just passive onlookers in society. They were market leaders, community organizers, and guardians of social order. But when the British arrived, they did not understand, nor did they care to understand how these communities worked. Instead, they introduced the warrant chief system, where select men were handpicked by the colonial administration and given the authority to rule as local representatives of the British Crown. Many of these warrant chiefs were unqualified in the eyes of the local people and grossly unpopular, and their presence created a legitimacy crisis. The British wanted control, efficiency, and taxes. Lots of taxes. They needed money to fund their administration, pay for infrastructure, and keep the colonial machine running. So they began implementing direct taxation systems, starting with men. This move was met with resistance, but it was eventually enforced using the warrant chiefs and local courts. But the problem was bigger than just the chiefs or the taxes. It was about power. The British had effectively sidelined women, removing them from roles they once held in community leadership. Traditional female institutions for women were now irrelevant in the eyes of colonial rule. But the truth remains that even though the women's voices had been pushed to the margins, they were not silenced. By the late 1920s, eastern Nigeria was a region under strain. Most of the warrant chiefs were corrupt and abused their powers. Market women were being fined, harassed, and manipulated by officials who lacked community trust. The price of goods was rising. The economy was shifting. The people, especially the women who were vital to trade and household stability, were growing increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. In late 1920s, news began to spread. Women too were going to be taxed. The idea alone was enough to ignite widespread panic and fury. Rumors circulated that colonial officers were going from village to village, conducting census not just for men but for women. To the women, this meant one thing: a new round of taxes. And they knew from experience that taxation under the British colonial rule came with no explanation and no mercy. Women then began to mobilize. Meetings were called, songs were sung. The storm was coming, and it would be unlike anything the colonial government had ever seen. The march that lit the fuse came from a town called Oloko in present-day Abia State. There in November 1929, a British colonial assistant named Captain Jesse Cook dispatched a warrant chief by name Mr. Okogu to begin counting women in the community. To the British, it was merely a census, but to the women, it represented a threat. Counting women signified that they might be next in line to be taxed. The memory of the unfair taxation that men had endured was still fresh in their minds as wives of the men that were taxed. Now, the same system was turning its gaze towards the market women, the farmers, and the mothers, the backbone of community. The women then refused to remain silent. A woman by name Wanyeruwa was approached by a colonial tax officer and told to, quote, count her goods and people. She responded fiercely, arguing that widows shouldn't be taxed at all. A scuffle then broke out. Within days, over 10,000 women from surrounding communities gathered. These weren't aimless mobs. The women came prepared. They brought with them a form of traditional protest known as sitting on a man. It was a time-tested method of shaming a man who abused power through dancing, singing protest songs, banging on walls, and sometimes camping outside his home until he corrected his behavior. This time they did not just sit on a man, they sat on the entire colonial system. Their demands were clear: stop the count, cancel the tax plans against women, and investigate the corruption of the warrant chiefs. The movement was organized. Women used town criers, palm front signals, and even coded messages in songs to communicate across villages. It was a grassroots operation with stunning efficiency. No social media at the time, no phones, just raw and local coordination of like minds. The British colonial administrators were stunned. These women weren't supposed to care about politics. They weren't supposed to protest. And they certainly weren't supposed to organize faster than the colonial government could react. But that's exactly what they did. As the protest spread from village to village and from hamlet to hamlet, thousands of women joined in from Aba, Owerri, Bende, Ugoja, Ikorobasi, Ikorikbene, and other places. The crowd was a sea of bold colors, headscarves, raised voices, and determined chants. Marketplaces were shut down, roads were blocked, warrant chiefs were surrounded in their homes and offices. It was akin to the Arab Spring of 2010. However, the British response was predictable and tragic. Troops were called in, shots were fired, women were killed. Reports later said that at least 50 women were killed, though unofficial accounts suggest the number may have been much higher. Many more were injured, beaten, or arrested. It was unacceptable. It was barbaric. The force employed by the colonial government was not proportionate to the women's action. But the violence did not kill the movement. It rather strengthened it. The women had made their points. They would not be ignored. They had drawn a line in the sand and dared the empire to cross it. What started in a small community was no longer a local protest. It had become a wildfire of defiance sweeping through the southeastern region of the country at the time. Within days, towns like Aba, Umuahia, Owerri, Calabar, Ikorekbene, Boni, Ikorobasi, and many other cities joined in the riots. Tens of thousands of women, estimates ranging between 25,000 to 50,000, were now part of what would go down in history as the Aba Women's Riot of 1929. The women weren't just marching in the streets. They demanded the dismantling of corrupt native authorities, fairer systems, and most urgently, the withdrawal of any attempt to tax them. Across communities, the same patterns emerged. Women surrounded British offices, sang songs of protest in unison, and chanted against injustice. In some places, they locked warrant chiefs in their homes, forcing them to resign or confess to corruption. These were strategic actions designed to disrupt a system the women had come to see as rigged against them, and they were effective. Take Aba for instance. In that commercial hub, thousands of women took over the town square. They shut down court activities. British officers were rattled. Orders for reinforcement were sent to Enugu, Calabar, Ikorekbene, Ikorobasi, Port Harcourt, and many other places. But even the military could not stop the momentum. Amidst all the chaos, it was clear that there was more than just politics involved in these riots. There was a sense of unity and spirit. Women brought food to one another, sang songs of courage, and took turns leading to avoid arrest that could disrupt the movement. Young girls also participated, passing messages between towns and keeping watch for soldiers. But then, in Ikorobasi, in present-day Akwa Ibom, tragedy struck when women surrounded a colonial outpost. Armed forces fired into the crowd. 33 women were killed on that fateful day alone. This was horrific. It exposed the cruelty of the colonial regime to the world. Newspapers in Nigeria, Accra in the then Gold Coast, and even London began to report on the scale of the protest. For the first time, the British government faced global pressure over their administration of Nigeria and the cruelty meted on innocent protesting women. And remember, this was in 1929. No social media, no hashtags, no global broadcast, just sheer words of mouth resistance and an unbreakable will to fight back. This was something the British did not see coming. So what did the colonial government do? First, they panicked. The scale of the protest was unlike anything they had faced before in Nigeria. Over 50 native courts were attacked. Several warrant chiefs were removed from office by sheer public pressure, and administrative buildings were damaged or destroyed. Then came the crackdowns. The British launched the Commission of Inquiry into the Aba Women's Riot to investigate what went wrong. But in typical colonial fashion at the time, they tried to downplay their faults. They rather blamed miscommunication, rumors, and emotional outbursts rather than addressing the core issues, namely corruption, exclusion of women, and abuse of power. But still, the damage control led to some real changes. One of the most important outcomes was the abolition of the warrant chief system in many areas. The protest had shown that the chiefs had no real legitimacy from the people and that they were mere puppets imposed on the people without consultation. The British realized that continuing to use them could spark even bigger revolts. In response, the colonial administration began to rethink its governance model in the then eastern Nigeria. They introduced new councils, this time with greater local participation, including women. It was a small step, but it marked the first official recognition that women's voices mattered in governance. Women like Nwanyeruwa, who helped spark the riot in Oloko, became folk heroes. Though little is recorded about her life after the protest, her role in history was secured. She became a symbol, a reminder that ordinary people could shake empires, and the memory of the Women's War lived on. In Nigerian history, the Aba Women's Riot stands out as one of the earliest mass movements against colonial rule. It wasn't led by politicians or foreign-backed militias. It was led by ordinary market women, farmers, mothers, daughters, and grandmothers, all united by a common cause. The riot also inspired future generations. Decades later, women involved in anti-colonial struggles, labor unions, and post-independence activism would cite the Women's War as proof that Nigerian women had always been in the fight. Even today, in towns across the southeast and south-south Nigeria, stories of the protest are passed down from grandmothers to grandchildren. The songs they sang, the fearlessness in the face of armed colonial police, the determination to say enough is enough. And the British, though they eventually regained administrative control, they never forgot 1929. The Women's War shattered the illusion of submission. It proved that underestimating the people, especially the women, was a costly mistake. But what happens when a protest ends? When the songs stop, the dust settles, and the people return home? For the women of the then southeastern Nigeria, the end of the 1929 Aba Women's Riot was not the end of their movement. It was rather the beginning of something far greater. The immediate aftermath was a mixture of mourning, silence, and reflection. Dozens of women had been killed. Families buried their loved ones. Communities took stock of the damage. But beneath the grief, awareness had been created. Women across Nigeria and even in other parts of British West Africa realized that collective action was powerful and that their roles extended beyond the kitchen. The riot became a reference point in women's movement for years to come. Fast forward to the 1940s and 1950s, and you will see the legacy in full bloom. Women began forming unions, associations, and cooperatives. Women like Fumilayo Ransom Kuti and Margaret Ekpo carried the torch. They fought for suffrage, labor rights, education, and inclusion of women in Nigeria's emerging political system, and often referenced 1929 as part of their lineage of resistance. Even after independence in 1960, echoes of the riot continued to shape Nigeria's gender politics. In history classes, cultural events, and traditional storytelling, the memory lives on. The songs they sang, the sacred symbolism of gathering at market squares, the spiritual resistance woven into traditional dances and protest. The legacy also lives in Nigeria's modern feminist movement. When women march today, whether for equal rights, against police brutality, or in defense of economic fairness, the spirit of the Aba women walks with them. It is a reminder that the fight did not start on social media. It started in village compounds, under trees, hamlets, beside calabashes of palm wine, where women strategized not just for themselves, but for generations to come. It was a revolution in rappers that rewrote Nigeria's story and refused to be forgotten, with an unshakable message left behind, namely, you cannot build a nation by silencing its women. Thanks for watching this edition of Back in History, and do remember to subscribe to the channel or follow the page for regular notification on every new video. Thanks also for continually returning to this channel and for sharing my videos with your friends and loved ones, even as I promise to continue in this mission for the documentation of the rich historical narratives of Nigeria and Africa. I am your friend and host, Ekemini Udim, wishing you the best in all you do.